Commissioner Fielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask both of you some questions about the student tracking before we get off the subject, but following up on what Commissioner Romer asked you, Ambassador Ryan. Historically, probably from the first days of our republic, the visa process has been part of the Department of State, and it's had a long history. And you've had a great deal of experience about it. You know, one of the things that we're chartered to do is try to figure out not only what mistakes were made, but how to correct the mistakes of the past. Let me ask you what seems like a pretty basic question. Should the visa processing still remain in the Department of State?
Yes, sir, I think so. I'm very biased about the officers in the State Department. I think that the people who work in the State Department are the finest public servants in the U.S. government today. And so I don't think that moving visas to another agency is the answer. I think strengthening the information and the intelligence that visa officers have, giving them more tools, giving them more staff, more money, those are all requirements. But I would hate to see, you know, moving people around just to do something, to make the American people think that they're safer. I don't believe that they would be any safer by moving it to another agency.
Well, of course, I'm not questioning the individuals themselves at this juncture. I'm just questioning the functionality of this and the duplicative nature of some of the problems that we run into all the time. And so if it's not to move it away from state and it's not to move it away from certain people that are doing it, what I was really asking is it better served and better integrated into our system by moving it elsewhere?
I don't think so, sir, no.
Thank you. Let me go to my original quick line of questioning on student tracking. Ms. Meisner, you testified that even if the student tracking system had been in place pre-9/11, I understand your testimony is that it's very unlikely that there would have been any arrest or that anybody would have picked up someone who had overstayed or hadn't ever even attended classes. Because there's a shortage of staff. Am I correct in understanding that?
That's correct.
Well, if there are not enough agents available, would you have any suggestions to provide to us as to how we could involve the education community into assisting the government in this regard, either by carrot or stick, by sanction if they don't, or by incentive to do so, or anything in that regard?
I think that the education community since September 11th does understand that it's an integral part of this element of immigration control. The problem with people who fall out of status or don't show up for classes, I think, is one where you have to, you know, essentially do triage in terms of, or think of it that way, in terms of your actual ability to arrest those people. My own sense is that if we had a better idea of who, and not by names, but of a profile of the types of individuals among the foreign student population that might be of highest concern for national security purposes, that you could start there.
Well, if I may interrupt you for a moment, I mean, triage presumes that you can't do everything at once, so therefore, but of course we're letting these people in, so we control the numbers of those. But I guess what I'm really looking at is you don't need a profile if somebody doesn't show up for class.
But let's say you have about 500,000 foreign students.
Okay.
So class starts presumably sometime during the first 2 weeks in September. Even if you know how many people haven't turned up in those 2 weeks, even if it's 0.5%, it's, let me do the math, it's thousands of people. So then the question is, even if you had many more thousands of investigators to check that out, where would you go first? And that's what I mean by triage. You, it seems to me, have to do one of two things. You either have to have a very well-developed random check kind of a program where whoever doesn't turn up for class, phalanxes of people go out and have the information in the data system of their addresses and find them. If they didn't turn up for class, their address in that data system may very well not be current, so right there you have, another set of things that has to happen. Or you have a good idea of who the most likely problem students are. They are either people that are studying certain very sensitive subjects. They are people who are in trade schools rather than in graduate schools. They are people who come from a particular country and are from a particular set of countries, are studying certain fields and have prior visa problems, something that gives you, that narrows the field. But I will have to tell you that I don't think that the thinking has advanced, any further than that on how you would do this, even, as I say, if you did have the thousands of investigators, because you've got to get to the point where you have some sense of what the threat is. And that kind of communication and that kind of analysis has not taken place in the past, and my understanding is it's not taking place today.
Well, not to beat this into the ground, but what role does the university play? What role does the school play?
Well, the university...
There's a lot of fraud out here, and we know it.
Well, I'm assuming that the university is doing its job of reporting the data, because the only way that you know who didn't turn up for class is that the university told you who didn't turn up for class through the data system. Now, the suggestion or the implication of your question is that you also have to have an ongoing monitoring effort of the universities, because they are not a one-size-fits-all. Most of them are very conscientious, some of them are not, and that monitoring, it has to be a parallel effort.
No, for sure. That's something we will have to address. Ambassador Ryan, on the same subject, in your interview, you were aware of this issue and discussed this issue with our staff. But you also noted that there had been a lot of opposition from the educational community to the imposition of this tracking system in years past. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That was pre-9/11, of course.
I understand that, but could you give us some idea of that history, please?
Well, as I remember it, when we were talking, we in INS, about how to set up what is now called SEVIS, which is the student tracking system, the universities were, at least the universities made their opinions, positions known, were very opposed to it. They were concerned about, issues of academic freedom. They were concerned about the fact that they would be reporting on students to the government. They were also concerned about the fact that there would be a fee involved that the student would have to pay, and that we were expecting the universities to collect that fee, and they didn't want to do that. Those were what I remember. But again, this was before September 11th.
Is that problem solved now? Either of you, I'd be curious by your answer.
I mean, there may still be philosophical objections, but it's the door is closed. This is no longer up for debate. I think one thing that might help here in understanding this is that Because I would agree with Ambassador Ryan's characterization of the debate that was taking place during that time. And it was a debate not only of concerns expressed by the schools, there was a strong feeling among some in the Congress that was similar. And there was a lot of conversation that took place between the government agencies and members of committees and others about how intrusive a system like this would be and whether it was appropriate. Well, one of the things that happened with this particular issue is that it was put into the legislation in 1996 at the last moment in quite a closed setting. And there had been no hearings, there had been no public debate, so that it was a kind of a situation where once the legislation passed, you had the debate that typically happens before legislation passes when some of these things start to get sorted out. And that was the environment that we were working in.
Okay, thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.